Good evening. Welcome to Fineprint. I'm Molly Gampir. Starting off with some big developments coming in from Russia. The Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev has submitted his resignation to the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Russian news agency is reporting that the President thanked the Prime Minister for his service but noted that the Prime Minister's cabinet has failed to fulfill all the objectives that were set. Media reports also saying that the President is planning to name Medvedev as the deputy of the Presidential Security Council. The announcement came shortly after Putin's State of the Union address, where he has proposed to tweak the Russian constitution to increase the powers of the parliament as well as the cabinet. The Russian president also suggested amending the constitution to allow lawmakers to name the prime minister and the cabinet members. That right currently belongs to the president.
Нельзя не считаться. Обсуждается конституционное положение о том, что одно и то же лицо не должно занимать должность президента Российской Федерации более 2 сроков подряд. Не считаю, что этот вопрос принципиальным, но согласен с этим. Изменить этот порядок и доверить Государственной Думе не просто согласование, а утверждение кандидатуры председателя правительства Российской Федерации. А затем по его представлению, по представлению председателя правительства, всех вице-премьеров и федеральных министров.
Many believe that such a move could herald Putin's intention of shift into a new position to stay at the helm after his current term expires. Putin's current tenure expires in 2024. The 67-year-old president has remained at the helm for more than 20 years, longer than any other Russian or Soviet leader since Joseph Stalin. Under the current law, Putin will have to step down after his term ends, as a president in Russia cannot have more than 2 consecutive terms. And now, with the Prime Minister's resignation and the resignation of the entire cabinet, many are speculating that Vladimir Putin may stay in charge by shifting into the post of the Prime Minister, after increasing powers of the parliament as well as the cabinet and trimming presidential authority. All of those reports coming in, a lot of speculation doing the rounds. Let's get in further details and updates now. Straight from Moscow, our correspondent Julia Chapman standing by. Julia, explain to us what's going on behind the scenes, far-reaching implications of the news just coming in.
That's right, and this was obviously a highly orchestrated move because nothing in Russia happens without the permission of President Vladimir Putin. And so the resignation of the Prime Minister and the government comes in order to allow President Putin to make his next moves. He did, as you said, announce today a number of changes that he is proposing to the Russian constitution, that he says he wants to put to the people of Russia in a vote, possibly a referendum that could take place as early as this summer. And those changes, as you'd outlined, involve handing more power to the parliament, more power to the prime minister, and restricting some of the powers of the president, and certainly restricting how long a president can be in charge, and therefore putting some restrictions on any successor to President Vladimir Putin. This comes at a time when there has been an enormous amount of speculation over what will happen next, what will happen in 2024 when President Putin's 4th and final term comes to an end. He's not able, under the Russian constitution, to run again for the next presidency, but he would be able to perhaps move into a different position, and it appears that that is what he is trying to do, and today has marked the first move in that process by announcing that some of the powers will be changing, the structure of the government will be changing. It's giving speculation to hints that he could be moving into the prime ministership once again. It's something he did in 2008 after his first 2 presidential terms. He stepped down, moved into the prime minister position, and allowed Dmitry Medvedev to serve as the president for 1 term, after which he then returned to the presidency. But now, of course, he has been limited. He can't run for president anymore, and so he's looking for his next options, and we're starting to understand what those might be.
Right. So, procedurally speaking, it's also very difficult to say at this point what happens next and what the time frame might look like for the next move by the Russian president, given that all of those rules might be changed because of the constitutional changes that he's looking at.
That's right. There is still a lot of uncertainty here. What is clear is that the Prime Minister Medvedev will probably remain in place for now until a replacement can be found. The government will continue in its business, but there will, of course, be adjustments being made in the coming months. And as I said, there could be a referendum held on these constitutional changes sometime this year. Next year will be the Duma vote, the elections on the Russian parliament, the lower house of parliament. And so it's very likely that if there is a referendum taking place on the constitutional changes, they will happen this year. But of course, President Putin still has 4 more years left of this term, and he will certainly be carrying them out. There's no suggestion that he would leave any earlier than that. But of course, nobody knew what he was going to do after that time, being restricted as he is against running for another presidential term. And so we're starting to understand that he could perhaps take the prime ministership once again, or maybe even lead the Russian Security Council. He has also, it is worth noting, offered Dmitry Medvedev, the current prime minister, to a position of the deputy head of the Russian Security Council, which is interesting given the speculation that that is something that President Putin could also be moving towards, the Security Council being an advisory body to the government, to the president. And in other former Soviet countries, such as Kazakhstan, that has been one way of the transition of power. We've seen in Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who was the president for many, many years, 25 years he was in power. He then stepped down in a surprise move last year and is now, many people say, still running the country, but from a different position as the head of the Security Council. So that could be what we also see from President Putin here in Russia.
Right. And Julia, before we let you go, I also want to touch upon the other aspect of that address that was made by the Russian president today. And the constitutional changes, of course, being one issue that will be discussed over the next few days and weeks to come. But the president today also announced financial incentives to boost birth rate in the country. A series of plans have been announced to increase the number of children being born in Russia, hoping to boost the average birth rate of under 1.5 per woman to 1.7 within a span of 4 years. Russia is seeing a decline in population because the generation becoming parents now were born in the 1990s, a time when the birth rate had fallen drastically due to economic uncertainties. Last year, the president had announced tax breaks for bigger families. This year, he is pledging state funding for new mothers.
Каждый наш шаг, новый закон, государственную программу мы должны оценивать прежде всего с точки зрения высшего национального приоритета – сбережения и приумножения народа России. Острейшая проблема, которая является прямой угрозой нашему демографическому будущему. Это низкие доходы значительной части наших граждан, семей. Причем по разным оценкам, порядка 70-80% семей с низкими доходами – это именно семьи с детьми.
Vladimir Putin has named poverty as a key factor in limiting the family size. Maternity capital has until now only been paid to families with at least 2 children. Now such benefits will also be paid for children aged 3 to 7 in low-income families. In addition to this, free school meals will also be provided for the first 4 years of schooling. According to the policy, a one-time payment of around $6,700 would be made to parents who will give birth to a child. For families with 2 children, the total payout will be around $10,000. Julia, this, of course, is a story that's been generating a lot of interesting remarks. Tell us more about the reasons why the Russian president has actually announced this incentive and, in a way, asked Russians to make more babies.
Well, there's 2 reasons, really. One of them, of course, is that the demographic issue has been a very serious one for Russia. Its population has been declining steadily, and there are certainly concerns about how rapidly it is shrinking. And so President Putin, of course, made these announcements in an effort to encourage Russian families to have more children. And part of that is also, of course, in order to give himself a political boost. He has seen some falling ratings over the last couple of years after the pension reforms that were introduced 2 years ago, and there was a wave of protests here in Moscow Moscow last summer, and all of that has led to some faltering popularity ratings for President Putin. And so he started his speech today with a raft of incentives for Russia's lowest earners, because, of course, Russia is a very unequal country. It's one of the most unequal developed countries in the world. And because, of course, here in Moscow, there are many people who live very comfortable lives, but in the regions, poverty is still a very big problem. And President Putin spoke about families where even both parents are working who struggle to make ends meet. And so that's why he's announced these incentives for those families to be able to have more children despite their low incomes, and also gave a boost to a number of other families who will be having more children, and for longer as well, until their children are 7, which has been brought up from the age of 3. So families who don't meet a certain threshold of income will continue to receive these subsidies from the government for much longer, and that will be a very big boost to Russia's lowest income families, which is obviously a target that President Putin is aiming to appease.
Right, and Julia, like you're saying, this and again is another attempt that's been made by Putin to give out the message of more authority and greater power. Also going back to the earlier point that we were discussing on the constitutional changes that he is eyeing now over the next few days and weeks, more clarity will emerge. But this would also lead many to draw parallels with what's happening in China, for instance, where Xi Jinping, of course, is a leader who many say will be there for life.
There have been comparisons drawn, of course, and President Putin has been in power for a very long time. As I said, this year marks the 20th anniversary of his first presidential election when he came to power in the year 2000. And there are, of course, many criticisms of President Putin for remaining in power for so long, even though he did, of course, step down as president after his first 2 terms. But then, of course, he returned to power 4 years later and then extended the terms of a presidency from 4 years to 6 years, which allowed him to govern for a further 12 years when he came back into power in 2012. And so that's why we will see him in power until 2024. But unlike China, of course, the powers are spread a little bit more broadly. And of course, we've seen from today President Putin announcing that the Parliament of Russia and the Prime Minister will be given greater powers. So he has been redistributing some of the powers of the Russian government, and those changes will become a bit clearer in the months to come. But there have, of course, been many criticisms of how long he stayed in power, how he has been unwilling to recede that power, to hand it over to any successor. It's very unclear who could be the next president of Russia. There is no obvious successor, and that's part of President Putin's very pressing problems now, because he needs to establish who will come into power in 2024 after him when he does have to step down from the presidency. And there's a lot of speculation over who that might be, whether it could again be Prime Minister Medvedev as he stepped into the role in 2008, or whether it could be someone else, another government minister perhaps. The defense minister is one of the people who has been speculated to take up that post, or perhaps the Speaker of the Duma. So there are a number of options for what could happen next. And of course, if President Putin does remain in a different post, he could still have a very firm grip on power, which has, of course, maintained the wrath of many people in the opposition who say that he should not be in power any longer.
Right. We're going to leave there for the moment. Julia Chapman, appreciate very much you joining us all the way from Moscow with those details and perspectives. Now, as we just discussed, for 2 decades now, Vladimir Putin has loomed large over Russian politics. A former KGB spy who took over the reins of Russia at the threshold of the 21st century, the name Putin has now become synonymous in a way with Russia at the world stage. But this did not happen overnight, of course. Let's take you through some of the highs and lows of Russia's modern-day Tsar. We start from August 1999, when the Russian President Boris Yeltsin named Putin, a little-known security officer, as his successor, but it was not without controversy. The announcement came amid a slew of apartment bombings in Moscow by Chechen rebels. Putin took the opportunity to go on the offensive and pander to the nationalist sentiment. Very soon, Vladimir Putin was not a nobody in Russian politics any longer. In December that year, Yeltsin resigned as president, leaving Putin to take over as acting president at the age of 47. In March 2000, Putin won his first presidential election and thus started his vice-like grip over Russian politics. His first term as president was quite challenging. This was the time when the Chechen rebels mounted a number of attacks on Russia. Chief among them was the Moscow theater hostage crisis. Almost 800 people were captured by the militants and 170 people lost their lives. Nonetheless, Putin romped to victory in 2004 with 70% vote share across the country. His first term had yielded improved standards of living for the people in Russia. And then in December 2004, he took a very controversial step. Putin abolished elections to elect regional governors, essentially reducing them to Kremlin appointees. Putin argued the move would help unify Russia. The Russian economy did reasonably well in his second term, mainly due to oil exploration across the country. But Putin ultimately had to give up his presidency in 2008 due to term limits on his presidency. He then handed over the post to his trusted deputy, Dmitry Medvedev, and took over as Prime Minister the very next day. Real power was always, of course, with Putin. In 2012, Medvedev called for Putin to return as president, and he obliged. For many people, Putin's third time was arguably the most eventful. In February 2014, as the Ukrainians ousted pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych at the time, Putin's forces moved in and annexed the Crimean Peninsula. What followed was a major international backlash, but Russia still controls Crimea and has even built a border separating it from Ukraine. And then in April 2014, rebels in eastern Ukraine, backed by Putin's Russia, revolted against Ukraine. The crisis has resulted in millions of casualties, and just this month, Putin sat down with Volodymyr Zelensky to iron out those differences. But all of these are trumped by what Putin did in September 2015. Putin sided with Syria's President Bashar al-Assad in his fight against the rebels. Russia helped change the tide of the war in Assad's favor. And even now, Russian warplanes are flying over Idlib, dropping bombs on what Syria calls a rebel bastion. In November 2016, Putin once again courted controversy when Donald Trump came to office. Russia was accused of interfering in the American elections. What followed, of course, was the huge political storm that ended in the Mueller report. In March 2018, Putin was elected once again. He will be in power until 2024. As of now, though, of course, a lot remains in the realm of speculation given what's emerged over the last 1 hour. One highlight of his fourth term, though, was the FIFA Men's World Cup, which was hosted by Russia in 2018. It was a major soft power coup for Vladimir Putin. But in July last year, Putin's throne was truly shaken by a mass protest in Moscow. Many independent candidates were denied permission to contest in the local elections. Opposition leaders, including the popular Alexei Navalny, were detained. Navalny was even poisoned in his jail cell. But in true Putin fashion, the protests were quelled. Moscow once again was quiet. Putin's career has been eventful, to say the least. He hunts in the Siberian mountains, practices judo with professionals, and rides horses bare-chested in the wilderness. But beneath all this, of course, is the meticulous, no-nonsense politician who has ruled Russia with utmost determination.